Good evening, everybody. Tonight I'll be going over the presentation that both Noah Keck and I worked on, and that'll be homosexuality in South Africa. So, with the purpose, I'm going to begin how South Africa went through a massive transition during apartheid, which shifted the country's values and beliefs. Due to all of the violence, corruption, and extreme racism that had come from apartheid, the homosexual community was outright neglected since they too were facing oppression. The purpose of this presentation will be to explore how homosexuality was perceived in South Africa before apartheid. Then we'll discuss how the implication of apartheid policy and the banishment of it impacted the homosexual community. Okay, to begin, I'm going to be talking about acts and policies that directly or indirectly impacted the homosexual community. So the Immorality Act of 1957, which was which replaced and kind of changed around the Immorality Acts of 1927 and 1950. It prohibited sexual intercourse or immoral acts between white people and non-white people. By immoral acts, I can only assume they mean like holding hands or acting like a couple. It also increased the amount of time someone goes to prison. It went from 5 years before to 7 years. But one strange detail about this act is that it prohibited sexual intercourse with people under the age of 16, and I'm not sure how they would really punish them. I'm assuming they'd maybe pay a fine or go to prison as well. This act didn't really directly impact the homosexual community, but indirectly it did because since it prohibited intercourse between white and non-white people, that also involves white and non-white homosexuals. An act that actually impacted the homosexual community was the 1969 Amendment Act because it made it a lawful crime for a man to have sex with another male under the age of 19. This act made the lives of many within the homosexual community very difficult. They couldn't even be themselves without being sent to prison. And mind you, this was following the implication of apartheid. So right here we have a primary source. It's a document talking about the Immorality Act of 1927. This one goes into a little bit more detail. What it practically says is that any European man who has sexual intercourse with a non-European female, or any European female that has sexual intercourse with a non-European man, shall be sent to prison for up to 5 years. And even though they weren't directing this to the homosexual community because it doesn't say anything about male to male, the same policy still applies due to the fact that there was homosexuality between white and non-white people. So an event that will live in infamy within the homosexual community in South Africa would be the 1966 Forest Town raid, which was very infamous due to the fact that police infiltrated a bottle party and made some ridiculous arrests for charges such as indecency just because a man was dressed as a drag queen. And at this point, it was a crime for them to be themselves, and it just shows the extent of oppression that the homosexual community was enduring at the time. Unfortunately, homosexuals weren't treated the best at the military as well, as they were subject to electric shock therapy, imprisonment, public humiliation, and beatings. So even though they were willing to serve their country weren't willing to show respect to them due to their sexual orientations.
On the left, we have Forest Town from above. On the right, we have Johannesburg Holocaust Genocide Center within Forest Town. Forest Town is the site of the 1966 Forest Town raid, which led to the 1967 Immorality Amendment Bill, which criminalized all sexual activity between men.
During the 1980s, there was two major gay rights groups that were formed in South Africa. The first one was known as GLOW, which was the Gay and Lesbian Organization of Witwatersrand. The second one will be known as Olga, which stood for the Organization of Lesbian and Gay Activists. The founders of the organizations were Simon and Coley, Linda and Goebel, and Pelisa Ditzi. Simon and Coley was also responsible for founding the National Coalition for Gay and Lesbian Equality, which was known as the NCGLE, and it would later be renamed and known as the Lesbian and Gay Equality Project, which in short stood for LGEP. The GLOW organization had a massive impact upon the South African community because they were responsible for creating the first ever massive gay and lesbian pride march. There were multiple reasons for why the march was organized. The main reason was that they wanted to fight against the homophobia that was going on within South Africa. They also did to bring attention to their demands, and they did it for more visibility and to also unite gay and lesbian people. Take note that during this time period, apartheid was nearing its end.
Simon Nicol was an anti-apartheid and gay rights activist in South Africa. He's a founder of GLOW and an organizer of the first Pride Parade in 1990. He was also a member of the International Lesbian and Gay Association Board, and he is one of the first gay right activists to meet the then president, Nelson Mandela, in 1994. He also helped lead groups to repeal laws that were anti-gay at the time. He also has his own day in San Francisco, and ultimately he ended up dying in November of 1998 due to AIDS.
After the end of apartheid, South Africa went through a massive transition in which the constitution made discrimination based on sexual orientation illegal. This would make South Africa one of the most progressive in the world in terms of personal freedoms. The new constitution states that no person shall be unfairly discriminated on one or more of the following grounds: color, sexual orientation. The homosexual community yet again had another victory in 1998 when the Employment Equity Act ensured that employers could not discriminate employees based on sexual orientation. One of South Africa's homosexual community's greatest achievements in their history was in December 1st, 2006, when the South African government passed the Union Bill, which would end up legalizing same-sex marriage, making South Africa the first African nation to do so. This wouldn't have been possible without the efforts of the South African homosexual community. It is astonishing that South Africa went from being a country whose government purposely oppressed the homosexual community by implementing acts that are inhumane to being a nation that legalizes same sex marriage. Of course, with there being changes in the law regarding to homosexuals, it doesn't really change the minds of the people who still feel negative towards the homosexual community, especially those who are extremely homophobic. So I wanted to go over this chart in the center right here that regards to a question on whether homosexuality should be accepted in society. And on the bottom right here, where it says South Africa, you can see that it has a high percentage of no compared to the yes. It just goes to show how, even though laws are implemented that support the homosexual or the LGBT community, it doesn't really mean that many will change their mind about how they feel and their homophobia. The chart on the left displays what penalties are targeted towards gays and lesbians in Africa as a whole continent, and of course, South Africa. This is following the Union Bill and everything, so South Africa is has recognized same-sex marriage. The figure on the right is technically the same one as the left side, but just with different colors and a few different statistics. But regardless, I believe it is very ironic that these figures display South Africa as being a more open country to the homosexual community, which in legal terms it is, but there's still many issues that occur to this day when it comes to the LGBT community and the unequal treatment that they receive from citizens, law enforcement, and many other city officials. As has been expected, of course, when laws are implemented, not everyone is going to follow them. So, unfortunately, for the homosexual community, even though they implemented laws that ban discrimination against homosexuals, the violence, the discrimination, the oppression, it didn't stop. According to a source by Filani, one of the most disturbing statistics is the prevalence of corrective rapes against lesbians. The statistics displayed that from 1998 to 2011, there were over 31 lesbian murders and only 2 convictions. Fear within the homosexual community had risen, and the police were doing little to nothing to stop what was going on. But of course, there are some in the police that probably didn't care or didn't take it serious, since they too felt certain ways about the homosexual community. According to a source by Wesley, the LGBT rights group known as Triangle said that it recorded 10 rapes per week in the Western Cape of South Africa. To this day, the LGBT community faces discrimination not in South Africa but everywhere in the world. It is unfortunate that the homosexual community has to endure discrimination to the present day. But of course, the homosexual community is one of the most persistent and bravest communities that chooses to fight for what's right. And that will conclude our presentation. Thank you for taking your time for watching and listening to this presentation that was created by Noah and I. And I hope everyone did exceptional on their presentations as well.